The winter sea off Wonsan, North Korea in March 1952 is iron grey and cold. Far from shore, a lean, fast battleship cleaves the swell. She is an Iowa-class capital ship built for speed protection and long-range gunnery. On the hills beyond the harbor, North Korean observers watch the water and count seconds between fall of shot and rising spray. Along the coast lie tunnels, bridges, and sidings that feed the front. Inside those targets sits the reason the ship returns day after day. If the rails close, the line of supply bends. If the rails open, the front holds. The question of this film is direct. Why did North Korea choose to engage a warship designed to defeat cruisers and survive heavy gunfire? And what did that decision reveal about shore defenses and modern sea power along the East Coast during the Korean War? The answer begins in the long blockade of Wonsan, a siege measured in months, and in the daily rhythm of bombardment and reply. Mines force predictable tracks. Batteries wait in revetments with pre-measured ranges. The ship accepts the risk to collapse tunnels, cut rails, and deny the port. The players are clear. On one side, the United States 7th Fleet, with an Iowa-class battleship screened by cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft that spot fall of shot. On the other side, the Korean People's Army coastal artillery and mine units, sited near Wonsan, Songjin, and Chaho, with observation posts on ridges and island points. The setting is narrow water close to land, where even a fast armored ship must steer within charts and shoals to bring guns to bear. The stakes are practical and immediate. Each salvo on a railhead slows trains that feed the ground war. Each shore burst that lands aboard can wound men, halt a mission, and force withdrawal from a firing box. Between those outcomes stands a test of doctrine, engineering, and nerve. When North Korea decided to fire on an Iowa-class battleship, it challenged the premise that a fortified coast could still push the largest ships back from decisive range. The war in Korea begins in June 1950, when North Korean forces cross the parallel and drive south toward Seoul. United Nations naval power responds within days. Carriers arrive, cruisers and destroyers escort, submarines patrol. The first purpose at sea is simple: control the littorals, interdict supplies that move by road, rail, and coastal barge. Keep amphibious options open for a flank strike. The east coast of Korea soon becomes a narrow stage where sea power can reach inland targets with guns and aircraft. By autumn 1950, the amphibious landing at Incheon has shown what naval logistics and fire support can achieve. The landing turns the ground campaign. United Nations forces advance through Seoul and push north toward the Yalu. Yet as the front shifts, the East Coast rail lifeline remains essential for the north. Coal and munitions travel down from the far northeast through Cheongjin and Songjin toward Wonsan and onward to the interior. Tunnels and bridges along this corridor are choke points that heavy naval guns can attack day after day. The logic is brutal and direct. If the rails are open, the north can sustain the field armies. If the rails are cut, the pressure at the front drops. Chinese intervention in late 1950 forces a new defensive line farther south. The front hardens through the winter of 1950 to 1951. Maneuver gives way to attrition. In that context, sea power becomes a tool to compress the enemy rear. The United States 7th Fleet and Allied navies expand bombardment boxes along the East Coast. They pair gunfire with aerial spotting to increase accuracy. They assign cruisers and destroyers to nightly harassment of bridges and sidings. They also begin planning for the long denial of Wonsan as a functioning port. The Iowa-class battleships enter this theater as instruments built for a previous world war, but still relevant. Each ship combines speed, armor, and firepower in a way no cruiser can match. A 16-inch shell weighing about 1,900 pounds can reach more than 20 miles with good accuracy when spotted. 5-inch batteries add flexible fire for closer targets. Radar and stable vertical systems improve solution quality even in poor visibility. The ships can absorb hits that would cripple lighter vessels. This matters near a defended coast. To cut tunnels, you must sometimes close distance. To close distance, you must accept the possibility of counterbattery fire. The defenders shape the coastline with mines and guns. North Korean naval forces seed mine belts near harbor approaches. Soviet-made contact mines and influence mines force ships into swept channels. Those channels are predictable. Predictable tracks are what shore batteries need. Along the high ground near Wonsan and Songjin, the coastal artillery staffs build revetments and casemates. They move guns into positions with pre-measured ranges and azimuth stakes. They practice silent drill. They preserve camouflage. Their purpose is not to sink a battleship outright. Their purpose is to impose caution and delay. A single hit can force a ship to break off a mission. A near miss can wound men and damage topside mounts. The arithmetic of harassment favors the shore if the ship must return again and again. United Nations mine warfare units answer with daily sweeps. Wooden minesweepers and auxiliary craft clear lanes under observation and fire. This is slow and dangerous work. It ties down escorts. It also creates the operational rhythm that will define the siege of Wonsan. Minesweepers go first. Destroyers and cruisers cover and engage flashes from the hills. The assigned battleship arrives on schedule and begins deliberate fire against rail yards, bridges, warehouses, and gun positions that reveal themselves. Aircraft from carriers or island strips orbit overhead as spotters. Onshore observers add corrections when possible. The coast becomes a gunnery classroom where both sides learn each other's habits. The political framework also pushes the campaign toward a prolonged blockade. After the initial swings of 1950, the war becomes a negotiation by fire. Armistice talks open and stall. Neither side wants to risk a decisive amphibious assault against a well-defended coastline. Yet neither side can ignore the value of choking the other's supply routes. For the United Nations command, the low-risk path to pressure is persistent interdiction at rail choke points and ports. For North Korea, the low-cost reply is to mine channels and engage from protected batteries whenever large ships must approach. By early 1951, the blockade of Wonsan is formalized. The duration will be measured in hundreds of days. The aim is to deny the port to the enemy and to keep the nearby islands under United Nations control. Those islands, Yeouido and Hwangto, and lesser rocks become forward spotting bases and picket points. Their occupation forces the defenders to split attention between landward and seaward fires. The result is a map with short, deadly distances. A gun on a ridge can reach a minesweeper inside the harbor. A battleship outside the harbor can reach the same ridge with the main battery. The logistics of keeping a battleship on station are non-trivial. Fuel must be run out from Sasebo or Yokosuka. Ammunition must be ferried by fast oilers and ammunition ships to replenishment areas at sea. Weather in the Sea of Japan can halt small craft but rarely halts a large Iowa-class hull. Crews cycle watches around the clock. Gun crews maintain liners. Ordnance teams handle powders and projectiles in a tight choreography that must be flawless. Every day, a schedule arrives. It lists bridges to drop and rails to cut and likely batteries to suppress. The ship steams in. The work begins again. Intelligence about the shore defenses improves over time. Photo reconnaissance builds a catalogue of revetments and decoy positions. Patrol craft note flashes and bearing lines and pass them up the chain. Intercepts capture fire plans and reinforcement orders. Reports from pilots and island observers help identify the tunnel mouths that are hardest to repair. The staff turns this into a cycle of targets that repeat as the enemy rebuilds. Rails are cut. Rails are repaired at night. Rails are cut again before dawn. This repetition favors the side that can fire heavy, accurate shells at will. The decision to bring an Iowa-class ship close enough for 5-inch and 16-inch work is not automatic. Commanders judge sea state wind visibility and the likelihood of counterfire. They weigh the value of an objective against the exposure time required. The shore can keep silent until the battleship commits to a straight run on a firing course. The crew on board knows this game. Lookouts scan the hills. Directors track puff and flash. The first hostile rounds usually bracket too long or too short. Corrections come quickly. The safest answer is speed discipline and a ready solution for counterbattery fire. North Korea does not rely on guns alone. Barges and small craft shuttle at night through creeks and islands. Trains move under cover of darkness and fog. Camouflage nets cover sidings and repair crews work in teams that disperse when aircraft appear. The aim is to reduce the observable signature that naval gunners depend on. In reply, the fleet increases use of airspot, even in poor weather, and adds radar ranging where terrain allows. The ships that rotate through this duty develop a shared understanding. Cruisers bring volume of 5-inch fire and fast turret slew for fleeting targets. Destroyers add close escort and radar picket functions. Minesweepers are the fragile edge that makes every other task possible. The battleship is the hammer that ends an argument when a battery insists on fighting. This division of labor creates confidence to approach again after each exchange. A scar on a mount, a patched hole in a deck, a note in the log. The formation adapts and returns. The strategic logic that leads North Korea to engage a battleship is not irrational. A coast that bristles with mines and guns can impose cost on even the strongest surface force. Hitting a large ship carries propaganda value and tactical value. It reminds the attacker that the shoreline is not a free fire zone. It forces caution. It may buy hours for a train to pass a choke point or for a bridge repair to finish. In a war where time and tonnage decide outcomes, a few hours can matter. The strategic logic that leads the United States Navy to persist is equally clear. The Iowa class can outshoot any fixed battery once located. It can remain on station in rough weather. It can deliver heavy shells without the sortie rate limits that aircraft face in bad conditions. It is also a symbol to allies and adversaries that the sea lanes remain under United Nations control. The risks are accepted because the reward is systemic. Every day, the rails stay cut, the pressure at the front increases. By the end of winter 1952, the pieces are in place for repeated clashes near Songjin and Wonsan. Batteries have tested their ranges, mines have been laid and relayed. The islands in the harbour are manned and fortified. The fleet knows the patterns of tides and land breezes and ground haze that can hide flashes at dawn. The assigned battleship makes ready with fresh liners and full magazines. The question is no longer whether the shore will fire. The question is when and how quickly the counterbattery will silence the position once it does. This is the build-up to the moment when a North Korean shell strikes an Iowa-class hull and throws splinters across a wooden deck. It is also the build-up to the answer the battleship gives. A measured reply, a ladder of splashes that walks across a hillside, a revetment that stops firing. The siege continues. The logic on both sides remains the same. The coast is a machine. The machine will run tomorrow unless the rails are cut again today. Dawn comes pale over the headlands east of Wonsan. Low cloud hangs over the bay. The sea is a flat metallic grey with a light swell from the southeast. The formation arrives on time. Ahead move the minesweepers in a careful line. Behind them, a picket destroyer keeps station to port and another to starboard. Farther out, a cruiser rides steady on the horizon. Astern by several miles, the Iowa-class battleship closes the distance at a measured speed. The schedule is precise and unromantic. Sweep the lanes, verify the channel buoys, establish the bombardment box, take soundings, confirm wind and visibility. Then begin the day's work against rails and tunnels. The first act belongs to the minesweepers. Their wooden hulls ease over the suspected fields while cables stream and paravanes bite at the water. They move slow enough that a man on the bridge can feel each change in vibration through his boots. When a float rides up on the cable, the cutter man waits for the line to pull taut. A small explosive charge breaks loose and a mine bobs to the surface like a sullen black drum. The waiting destroyer fires with a rifle-caliber mount. The mine jumps once and disappears in a sheet of spray. Each kill adds seconds to the clock that the larger ships must respect. The channel will be usable only after this list is complete. The destroyers hold the inner cordon. Each one has a specific sector and a specific set of ranges memorized from past patrols. Their 5-inch mounts are already trained to likely flashes on the hills. Radars sweep and repeat. Lookouts scan the folds of land above the harbor road where the enemy has cut narrow access tracks to silent gun positions. Aboard the cruiser, the air search set shows 2 dots that move in slow circles. Spotter aircraft are up from a carrier to the south. Their radios crackle with the clipped rhythm of altitude calls, wind estimates, and requests for trial salvos. High above the low cloud, a second pair of aircraft loiters with cameras and spare film for a mid-morning run when the light improves. The Iowa-class battleship approaches the bombardment box like a machine returning to a known task. Bridge watch calls speed and course changes in a steady cadence. The ship answers with a slight heel and a low tremor that runs through the deck. Forward, the main battery crews stand by in the turrets. Breech blocks are oiled and checked. Carts of cloth powder bags line the handling scuttles in order. Shell hoists are run once to full travel and back to confirm the motion is smooth. In the plotting rooms, men speak in even tones as they set initial solutions based on the previous week's surveys and the latest wind aloft. The day's target list is ordinary and therefore important. 2 tunnels west of Wonsan that have been cleared by night labor. A siding near a cut where loaded wagons have been seen at first light. A rail bridge farther north whose timber spans show fresh work in the reconnaissance photographs. A storage shed near the waterfront that likely holds repair steel and tools. None of these targets is dramatic. All of them matter because they connect the coast with the inner road net that feeds the ground front. The plan is to degrade them in sequence and then repeat as needed with airspot corrections. At first light, the battleship begins with the southern tunnel. The spotter over the inland ridge asks for a trial pair from the forward turret. 2 shells leave with a flat concussion that makes the bridge windows tremble. Seconds pass as the ship keeps her line. High above the cloud, the spotter watches dark puffs step down toward the hillside. His call is precise: 100 short, 50 right. Fire for effect. The turret captain repeats the order and the deck shudders as the full battery answers. On the hillside, a section of earth slumps and dust lifts in a pale curtain. The spotter calls more left. The next ladder walks across the face of the tunnel mouth and the calls shift to damage assessment language. Roof collapse. Portal blocked. Secondary smoke. The ship notes the result and shifts. The destroyers now see activity on the opposite ridge. A faint puff and a darker sting suggest a trial shot from a hidden gun. The lead destroyer answers with 2 5-inch rounds to mark the bearing. The cruiser's forward turrets throw heavier shells at the same slope with time fuses that scatter fragments over a wide arc. The hill goes quiet again. It is not yet serious counterfire. The shore crews have learned the value of silence until a better moment. The formation keeps to the rhythm. The minesweepers clear a second lane toward the inner harbor. Each lane is a future path for cutter boats that may have to retrieve downed pilots or support a raid on the islands. Mid-morning light sharpens the shapes of the land. Haze thins over the coastal flats and makes the rail embankments stand out in clean lines. The second tunnel receives its due. The spotter asks for a quick bracket and then a full pattern. The battleship responds with an economy that only a practiced crew can manage. Shells climb and fall in a precise cadence. On the ridge, a section caves and the mouth darkens under a sweep of fresh debris. The spotter asks for a sweep 50 yards wide at the portal to collapse the repair cribbing. The gunners adjust the deflection, and the shake of the broadside carries across the deck plates like a slow drumbeat. When the dust clears, the mouth is a broken oval with fresh rock scattered forward. The ship logs the time and the result. The target list now moves to the siding north of town. This is a job for 5-inch mounts. The battleship eases in closer under the cover of the cruiser and the destroyers. On the pier, a handful of small shapes scatter as flashes begin to stitch the siding. A low building near the end of the track blows apart in a quick burst of wooden fragments. The spotter calls a correction toward a dark rectangle that might be a shed of spare rails. The mounts slewed and fired, a thin smoke rises and blows crosswind toward the river mouth. The ship records the rounds expended and the observed results. This pace is workmanlike. The formality hides the violence that the crews are now used to. Near midday, the formation shifts north towards Songjin, where previous reconnaissance showed trains halted at a bend near a shallow valley. The transit is uneventful, except for a cluster of fishing junks that dart away when the leading destroyer pipes a warning. The batteries rest. Lunch is taken in shifts. The sea remains calm. A long line of low cloud rides the inland hills. The first task at Songjin is to test the valley with a pair of ranging shots from the main battery. The spotter watches 2 brilliant white splashes rise in the far field. He calls a slight over and a slight right. The turret answers with a 3-shell ripple. When the dust lifts, there is a line of dark gaps along the embankment where cross ties have been torn free. The shore answers for the first time with intent. A flash on the inland slope is followed by a faint rumble that rolls over the water. The shells fall long and throw geysers behind the battleship's wake. The officer of the deck orders a small turn to keep the ship on her planned run. The cruiser replies at once with a half-salvo of 8-inch shells at the suspected gun pit. The destroyers add bursts of time, fused 5-inch shells that fill the air with fragments above the position. The shore goes quiet again. The spotter calls continue mission. The next salvos walk the track toward the bend, and a dust cloud blooms where a small structure had stood. The voice on the air is steady and unemotional. Rail cut. Secondary explosion likely from fuel. Shift left to bridge approach. Afternoon brings wind across the beam and a low sun that complicates spotting. Glare turns the sea into bright scales. The formation adjusts its courses to keep the ship sunward of the target line when possible. The spotter asks for a pause to change film and hand over to a fresh crew. During the pause, the battleship turns slightly to present a narrower silhouette to the likely gun arcs on the hills. A gun captain uses the lull to check a bulky rammer that has been slow since morning. The powder crew dries damp gloves on a rail. The men do these small tasks without hurry because each one holds a place in the ritual that keeps the guns safe. The next objective is a stone arch bridge near Songjin, whose abutments have survived previous attacks. The plan is to drop the spans by collapsing the earth at the north abutment. The spotter calls for a left bracket. The first 3 shell ripple puts a line of boils in the river just short. The second ripple lands among the brush on the riverbank. The call is steady, 5 left, 100 over. Fire for effect, the main battery fires with the slow, heavy rhythm of a ship that knows its own strengths. On shore, a square of dark stone shifts and sags. A cloud of dust lifts from the abutment like steam from a kettle. The next ripple follows without pause. When the smoke clears, the arch has a visible kink and a section of parapet leans into the gap. The spotter calls probable dislocation, order a follow-up with delayed fuses to tear out the base. The turret answers and the bridge finally shows a clean break in the mid-span. During the bridge work, counterbattery fire begins in earnest. 2 enemy guns open from different bearings. The first shot falls short and right. The second walks closer and throws shrapnel across the surface. The battleship keeps to her firing course for the last salvo, and then the conning officer orders a turn that brings the stern guns to bear. The aft turret captain calls ready. The ship lurches slightly as the 3 guns speak in quick succession. On the hillside, 3 brown eruptions rise almost in line. The destroyer to starboard adds a string of 5-inch shells with proximity fuses that burst overhead. The spotter watches the hillside through the new dust and calls cease after observing no further flashes. The line of effort now shifts back toward Wonsan for late afternoon work on the waterfront storage area. The minesweepers have cleared an inner lane that permits a closer approach. The battleship takes station outside the harbor mouth, while the cruiser and destroyers form a semicircle at mid-range to interdict any small craft. The spotter calls a warehouse cluster with a long roof of corrugated metal. He asks for 5-inch fire to tear the roof and 16-inch shells to collapse the frame. The ship obliges. The 5-inch mounts pace the main battery by seconds so that lighter fragments rain over the site just before each heavy impact. The building buckles inward. A secondary flame flickers. The warehouse is no longer usable at night. Late-day light turns the sea coppery and shows every gun flash in the hills with painful clarity. The enemy uses the light to send a careful ranging series from a position that has not yet disclosed itself. The pattern begins long. The next falls short. The third and fourth bracket the formation's track. The picket destroyer lays a smokescreen on order. The battleship turns a degree to complicate the enemy's range card. The cruiser opens with rapid 8-inch fire and walks it across the slope that matches the best intersection of bearings. The spotter works a fast search pattern and catches a brief black plume from a revetment cut into a terrace. He calls the grid. The battleship's forward turrets answer with a 3-shell ripple, followed by another 3. The terrace collapses in a sliding sheet of dirt. The smokescreen thickens. A breeze clears it and the hillside is quiet. Evening comes on with a chill wind and a thin fog that crawls down the gullies. The formation completes its last scheduled task with 5-inch counter-mobility fire on the harbor road. The purpose is to crater the surface and force repair crews to waste hours of darkness on shovels and fill. The mounts fire in a steady cadence, each burst a dull orange flower against the gathering grey. The spotter calls last adjustments and then signs off to return to the carrier. The battleship logs the time the rounds expended and the assessed effects. She turns onto a night course that keeps clear water to seaward and known shoals to landward. Night does not mean safety. The minesweepers fall back behind the screen and the destroyers sharpen their watches. A radar scope shows faint clutter near a river mouth that could be small craft. The nearest destroyer investigates and finds nothing solid. The cruiser's lookouts report a low glow along the ridge opposite the harbor. It fades after a minute. A staff officer on the battleship notes it as possible. Work light then crosses it out when the glow does not return. The ship's crew rests in thirds. Gun crews sleep near their stations. Powder bags are returned to lockers. Breech blocks receive a final wipe and a thin coat of oil. Before midnight, a brief alarm crackles over the radio as a string of star shells climbs over the inner harbor. A patrol boat inside the islands reports movement near a jetty. The cruiser answers with a short barrage that scatters water across the pilings. The night returns to quiet. At 2 in the morning, the wind dies and the sea becomes slick and dark. The battleship settles into a long, slow roll that rocks the men in their bunks. Somewhere inland, a locomotive whistle sounds once, then not again. Dawn returns, and with it the same tasks in a new light. The opening moves repeat because the geography and the logic do not change. Mines must be swept, lanes must be confirmed, the formation must take its box, the spotters must mark and correct, the guns must do their slow, precise work. The enemy chooses moments to answer. Sometimes the answer is a single flash and a single shell that falls wide. Sometimes the answer is a tight string that walks closer until the counterbattery finds the revetment and pulls it apart. The opening moves are therefore not a single day but a pattern of days. A system learns the contours of another system and tests them again. In these first cycles, the battleship and her escorts refine their techniques. The gunnery officers adjust charge weights for the morning chill that thickens the air. The spotters record how ground haze pools in the valleys until mid-morning and demands higher aim points for silhouettes. The minesweeper captains learn which corners of the harbour throw strange echoes that mimic mine shapes on the sweep gear. The destroyer gunners grow adept at latency between observed flash and optimal burst height for airbursts over dug-in crews. Each correction is small. Together they make the next day's opening safer and more effective. The enemy also refines. New camouflage darkens the lips of gun pits. Dummy positions appear to draw fire. Fresh rails and ties are stacked a mile away from the usual repair sites to mislead aerial cameras. A rumor moves through the fleet that a heavier gun has been brought up from the rear. No one on board the battleship can confirm it. The men do not need the rumor to be true to keep their habits. Every course change is crisp. Every voice in the director is level. Every powder bag is handled as if the ship itself depends on that single lift and ram. By the end of these initial cycles, the pattern has definition. The formation enters each morning with a reasonable expectation of cutting rails and damaging portals. It leaves each evening with a reasonable expectation of returning to the same places the next day. The shore batteries pick their moments close to the times and courses when the battleship must commit to a steady run to land accurate fire. The duel is a contest of patience and nerve more than a contest of surprise. The opening moves are about establishing that rhythm and proving to each side what the other can do. On the morning that will become notable, the sequence begins like all the others. Minesweepers creep, destroyers watch, the cruiser sets her range drums, the spotter calls for a trial pair on a tunnel near Songjin. The brackets land textbook straight, the correction is small, the main battery prepares to fire for effect. Men on deck feel the set of the ship and know from the heel how many guns will speak. In a fold of ground beyond the coastal road, a camouflaged muzzle lifts by 1 degree. The crew behind it has waited through many dawns for the small alignment of range, wind and course that now lies before them. The decision to fire belongs to a voice in a pit cut from clay. The answer that will follow belongs to a ship designed to put heavy steel exactly where the spotter asks for it. The opening moves are complete. The duel is ready to begin. The morning at Songjin begins with routine. The formation holds to its practiced pattern. Minesweepers creep along the cleared lane. Destroyers take their arcs to port and starboard. A cruiser sits at mid-range with turrets trained on the interior slopes. The Iowa-class battleship steadies on her firing run. The air is cool and dry. A low ceiling of cloud hangs over the coastal hills and turns the light flat and even. The spotter above the haze calls a tunnel portal that shows fresh scrape marks and a narrow ribbon of steam. The bridge acknowledges. The gunnery officer checks the charge weight and the powder temperature and gives a quiet order. In turret 1, the breech blocks close like vault doors. The first pair goes out with a firm lifting shove, and the ship's long hull answers with a slow elastic rebound. The splashes step down toward the ridge in clean white cones. The spotter's voice is exact. 50 yards long, 20 left. Fire for effect. The forward turret captain repeats. The next ripple lands where the earth meets the cut stone. Dust lifts and drifts crosswind. The officer of the deck holds the line. The helmsman watches the angle of heel on the repeater and feels for any set from the swell. Inside the plotting room, 2 men speak in low tones as they adjust the fuse settings for the shells that will follow if the portal does not collapse on schedule. The work is calm. The ship is a machine that does not hurry. The first hint of the counterstroke is not a flash. It is the thin smear of a shadow where the coastal road bends behind a low rise. A lookout marks the spot with a grease pencil on the inside of a bridge window. A second later, a brief yellow tongue shows and a darker puff follows. The sound arrives a moment after that. It is a flat thud with a tail that the men on the forward superstructure feel through their boots. The officer of the deck calls maintain course. The conning officer answers with a steady eye. The crew has heard this before and expects the first rounds to be long. The first round is long. A column of water rises beyond the stern and falls in a lace of spray. The second shot is short and throws heavy drops against the starboard quarter. The third is a near bracket off the port beam that leaves a taste of salt and cordite in the air. The fourth shot is the one that matters. It comes in flat and hard from the landward side and strikes the starboard 40mm mount shield with a sound like an anvil struck by a falling tree. Wood splinters from the teak deck in long curls. A shower of jagged steel punches through lockers and toolboxes and ricochets under the lifelines. 3 men go down with torn jackets and dark blood on the wood. One man rolls twice and stops against a scupper with his eyes open and fixed. Smoke rises in a thin grey sheet. Someone yells for a corpsman. Someone else is already there with a field dressing unrolled. The damage control talker on that circuit speaks evenly and calls the hit location and the status. The bridge answers and notes the time. For a heartbeat, the ship holds her firing course. The conning officer needs to decide whether to keep the line or swing the stern to bring the after turrets to bear. The decision comes from the captain's chair in a level sentence. Hold for 2 salvos, then bring stern to bear. The gunnery officer nods and speaks into his own circuit. The forward turrets send their reply with the dignity of heavy steel. The broadside climbs and the hull rises under the recoil and then settles again with a long cat-like stretch. On the hills beyond the coastal road, 3 pale boils of dust jump almost together where the fire control solution believes the enemy pit lies. The spotter calls 50 right. Repeat. The captain's order to turn follows, and the ship answers with a slow, deliberate swing that keeps clear water to seaward and the land at a constant distance on the beam. The cruiser begins her part without prompting. Her forward turrets throw 8-inch shells with time fuses set to burst above the suspected terrace. The bursts hang for a breath like violent white flowers and then drop a sleet of fragments across the slope. The starboard destroyer lays a short smokescreen to confuse the enemy range card and then shifts to a proximity fuse pattern that walks along the ridge in 50-yard steps. The minesweepers fall back a cable length and keep their lane. On the battleship, the aft turret captain calls ready in a voice that sounds almost bored. The director settles. The pointer and trainer keep the cross and the dot where the talker tells them to keep them. The after turret fires 3 in a ripple that is as precise as a metronome. In the right seat of a slow-circling aircraft, the spotter watches the hillside through a haze of dust and sees a rectangular shadow that is not a natural shape. He calls a correction left and a small decrease in range. The next 3 shells land in a line that lifts dust straight up and then outward. The rectangular shadow disappears as the terrace lip gives way. The spotter calls on the net for another 3 to walk down the slope and finish the job. The after turret answers. The ship steadies on the new heading. The officer of the deck checks the distance off and the depth sounder and keeps a weather eye on the low land ahead. The captain keeps his face on the glass and his voice off the net. Every man does the part he has done before. The damage control parties have already cordoned off the struck mount and are sweeping hot fragments into a canvas bag with gloved hands. A metal shard the size of a hand has welded itself into a corner of the shield and still smokes. A boatswain's mate clears the splintered teak with a push broom so that medics do not slip. The wounded are lifted onto stretchers. One is awake and curses the sting in his shoulder and then apologizes for the language. One is quiet and white around the eyes but nods when asked a question. The third looks at the medic and tries to speak. The medic says do not worry about it now and ties off a bandage with a quick sailor's knot. The runner heads for sick bay with the paperwork. The chief damage controlman leans close to a talker and says in a normal voice that the fire is out and the space is clear of smoke. On the hills, the enemy battery tries one more ranging shot and gets nothing for it except 2 5-inch airbursts from the starboard destroyer and a heavy dose of 8-inch fragments from the cruiser. The spotter reports no more flashes. He adds 2 short phrases that matter to the men below. Gun pit caved, position silent. The captain does not smile. He says resume mission. The officer of the deck gives the course to bring the forward turrets to bear again on the rail targets. The ship answers as she always does, with obedience and a faint new vibration in the deck, where the splinters chewed the planks. The decisive character of this moment does not lie in the extent of the damage. It lies in the speed and accuracy of the reply and in the discipline that keeps the formation inside the enemy's engagement envelope long enough to finish the work. The battleship does not sprint away after the hit. She completes the turret cycle on the tunnel. She methodically pounds the abutment of the river bridge. She lets the 5-inch mounts return to the siding and the waterfront sheds. The cruiser and destroyers keep their counter-battery arcs hot and ready. The minesweepers hold the lane and do not panic. The air spot keeps orbit and calls the last corrections even as the pilot glances down at the still water near the ship and wonders how long a heavy shell takes to cross that distance. On the bridge, the captain asks for the latest wind aloft and a confirmation of the powder temperature in magazines that were opened on deck during the morning. The answers come back in even tones. The gunnery officer adjusts a small term in the solution to anticipate the next salvo's spread. Inside the plotting room, a petty officer with a pencil behind his ear writes the time and the bearing and the observed effect on a card and tucks it behind a metal clip. He will later send that card to a drawer where similar cards wait for a staff officer to make a graph of how quickly batteries are found and reduced. Every war teaches a new graph. This war teaches time to counter-battery and rounds to silence. The turning point also exists in the heads of the men on both sides. On shore, a crew that has waited many days for a hit learns what follows when that hit lands. The weight of the reply tears the hillside and strips the camouflage from the revetment. The men on the gun line feel a shockwave pass through the dirt under their knees and taste dust that sticks to the roof of the mouth. A runner looks over his shoulder and decides that the next shell will come lower. He moves without orders. The chief of the battery tries to keep his voice from rising as he calls for an alternate position that has not been used in weeks. The telephone line is already down. The gun cannot be swung fast enough to matter. The pit goes quiet because the pit has ceased to be a pit. Afloat, a crew that has watched green water climb the armor belt in earlier storms and has seen shells fall long for many dawns takes a new lesson from a light wound and a small fire. The lesson is not that they are invulnerable, it is that they can be hit and still keep the line and the schedule. The chief boatswain walks past the splintered planks and says to a young seaman that the deck will get new wood when they next hit Sasebo. The young seaman nods and looks at the black marks and does not say anything. The guns speak again and the sound rolls down the length of the ship and off the stern into the white wake. The voice on the air from the spotter is the same calm voice as before. The ship resumes her work. The captain now has to choose whether to continue the day's plan at Wonsan or to exploit the brief quiet at Songjin and collapse a second set of portals. He chooses the latter. The formation shifts a few miles along the coast. The cruiser holds a covering position and the destroyers stay tight to the battleship's quarters. The turn gives the enemy a chance to observe the new course and perhaps to bring a second battery online. The smoke generators are checked but not used. Too much smoke will blind the spotter. The decision is conservative and confident. It says that the ship will not be chased from this coast by one hit. It says that the plan is stronger than the single surprise. The next target is a tunnel that has defied damage by clever earthwork around the mouth. The gunnery officer orders delayed action fuses to burrow under the lip before bursting. The spotter asks for a short ladder and then a linear pattern to rake the berm. The forward turrets obey. The shells arrive with a rhythm that men on deck can now predict by the feel in their ribs. The hill answers with a short spatter of small arms fire from men who do not know that the fragments from 5-inch proximity bursts will soon make that gesture dangerous. The destroyer obliges with 3 neat bursts that purr into white spheres above the brush. The brush stops moving. The main battery continues its slow tearing work. A section of the berm slides and a dark hole gapes where the mouth had been shaped to resist. During this sequence, the medical officer sends a brief message to the bridge. The wounded have been stabilized. One will be transferred to a cruiser with a larger sickbay when weather permits. The others will return to light duty in a day or 2. The captain reads the note and nods once. He says nothing over the net. He watches the shoreline. He watches the bearing lines that do not change when fire control is right. He watches the cutter boat ready on the davits in case a spotter has to ditch. His face does not move. He has seen men killed in earlier wars and will see men killed in later years. He is here to keep a schedule that turns fire into a change in the enemy's ability to move supplies. The decisive action reaches its natural end when the hillside stops answering and the target list for the day is complete. The battleship turns out to sea and runs a short leg that gives the deck parties a chance to police fragments and sweep blood away with seawater and sand. The smell of oil and sap from the torn teak mixes with the clean iodine scent of spray. Men eat in shifts. The minesweepers close again to check a buoy that has dragged. The cruiser's gunnery officer writes 3 lines in a log about the effectiveness of time fuses over dug-in batteries at the ranges used today. The destroyer captains send brief signals that their mounts expended fewer rounds than yesterday for the same effect, which means the fire control solutions are improving. The spotter sends down his film and a short written note through the carrier group. The note is dry and unadorned. It confirms the collapse of 2 portals and the dislocation of a bridge span. It confirms that a shore battery was silenced and that no fresh flashes were seen after the 3rd ripple from the aft turret. It recommends that tomorrow's mission begin with a search for a second position that may have been a decoy. The staff will fold the note into a folder that already holds many similar notes. The men on deck will not see that folder. They will see a fresh laundry line and a coil of new manila rope near the struck mount where the old rope was cut by splinters. Evening draws down and the light turns the ridges into layered paper. The formation glides back toward Wonsan with the ease of men who know every point on this inland sea. The wind drops, the sea smooths, the ship's wake turns to a clean white arrow behind the stern. On the bridge, the captain permits himself a single brief sentence that is not in any manual. He says that the men did well. He keeps his voice low. The conning officer nods. The helmsman looks over without moving his hands. In the aft turret, a loader rubs his shoulder and smiles at nothing. In the forward passage, a medic washes his hands and then stands for a long moment looking at the water through a porthole. The turning point is recorded in the next morning's orders as a line of text that a yeoman could have typed in his sleep. It notes a direct hit received by the battleship at Songjin with minor damage and 3 wounded. It notes the silencing of an enemy battery within minutes. It lists the rail targets to be revisited and the bridge to be checked for complete failure. It assigns the same arcs to the same escorts with the same clocks and the same expectations. Routine is the instrument by which a decisive moment is absorbed and turned into a result that matters beyond the moment. On shore, men in a ruined revetment will spend a cold night in a ditch and talk softly about the weight of the shells that took their pit apart. They will speak without bravado. They will say that the big ship did not turn away. They will say that another position will be built and that another shot will be taken when the track of the morning run becomes familiar again. At sea, men under a patched deck will sleep in thirds and wake for their watch with the same checklists as yesterday. They will know that a shell can reach them from land. They will also know that their ship can take that strike and return more than it receives. The decisive action at Songjin, therefore, does not end with a cheer or a banner. It ends with the quiet of a coast that has been beaten back to silence for the day and the steady breathing of a ship that keeps to her patrol line. It alters the minds of crews who now believe even more firmly in the drill that carried them through. It alters the arithmetic of the blockade by proving again that a fast armored battleship can operate within the reach of shore guns and mines and still complete the task. It seals the answer to the question set at dawn. A fortified coast can hurt the largest ship afloat if a shell lands clean. It cannot stop that ship if the formation holds its nerve, and if heavy guns put steel on the right piece of earth fast enough to tear the revetment out by its roots. When darkness finally covers the hills, the battleship turns onto her night course and rides the slow swell eastward. The deck crews coil down the last hoses. The gun captains remove their gloves and tuck them into belts. The medic writes 3 names in a log and closes it with care. The captain steps out onto the wing of the bridge and tastes the salt and the faint smoke that still lingers. He looks toward the shore where no flashes show. He looks down at the deck where the splinters have been swept away. He looks ahead to a black horizon that he has seen before and will see again. The decisive action is over. The siege goes on. The sea east of Songjin returns to its mild roll by late afternoon. Smoke drifts in thin bands over the ridges where the revetment fell. On the battleship, the wooden deck around the struck mount is rinsed with buckets and hoses until the water runs clear. A boatswain's mate sprinkles sand so men will not slip. The splintered teak goes into canvas bags alongside bent metal and a warped tool locker door. A chalk mark on the shield circles the crater where the fragment punched in. The chief engineer signs a brief note that the impact scar does not affect fighting efficiency. That phrase will appear again in the typewritten summary sent ashore. The wounded lie on narrow bunks in sick bay with clean dressings and a smell of antiseptic in the air. A corpsman checks pulses with a watch held up to the light and writes time and rate on a card clipped to each blanket. The medical officer steps into the passage and dictates a short message that confirms 1 man for transfer when weather allows and 2 set to resume light duty within a day. A runner carries the page to the bridge. The captain reads it and sets it under a grease pencil board that still shows the afternoon firing plan. No voice on the circuit changes tone. The duty rotations hold. The ship keeps her lane past the outer buoys. The escort commanders file their own small reports. The starboard destroyer notes that proximity fuses at the observed range produced reliable airbursts over dug-in slopes. The port destroyer recommends a minor change to smoke generator practice to avoid blinding the spotters during short turns. The cruiser gunnery officer records that time fuse settings bracketing the terrace were effective at compelling the shore crew to abandon the pit before the heavy shells arrived. These lines will become bullets on a staff sheet and then lines on a gunnery school slide weeks later. The men who wrote them return to their watch bills and the routine that keeps the formation alive inside a defended coast. The immediate tactical result is simple. The tunnel mouths near Songjin are blocked again. The bridge span shows a clean break. The siding warehouses at the waterline are wrecked. A gun position that scored a rare hit has been silenced. The formation can remain on task long enough to complete the day's list. The next morning, the minesweepers will re-enter at first light to check for fresh mines set during the night. The battleship will fire again at repaired rails and fresh cribbing. The enemy will attempt counterbattery again when the geometry favors a steady run. The duel continues because the geography demands it. The operational effect spreads outward along the rail net. A train that might have passed at dusk now waits at a siding under a canvas drape. Repair crews gather with jacks and ties and iron dogs and then stop when a patrol aircraft circles low. The men return after midnight with dim lamps and try to clear the portal. They work in short bursts because they expect 5-inch fire to sweep the road near dawn. A locomotive whistle sounds once and fades when a break in the embankment is found. By morning, the line is not ready. The front that depends on that flow of coal and shells and rations receives less than planned. A small deficit becomes a pattern over weeks when portals are collapsed again and again. The political consequence inside the United Nations command is a reinforcement of the blockade logic. Staff officers brief that a fast armored capital ship with accurate spotting can operate within range of shore guns and mines and still achieve repeatable interdiction. The brief uses plain charts. It shows dates. It shows the number of days rails stayed cut after specific actions. It shows the rate at which coastal batteries are found and reduced when the formation holds its nerve. It says that a costly amphibious assault to seize Wonsan outright is not required to deny the port. It says the siege can remain a siege. On the North Korean side, the propaganda line emphasizes that a coastal battery hit a battleship. A painted board will show a rough silhouette and a red star marking the point of impact. The crew that survived will be praised. New gun pits will be dug farther back and lower to the ground to cut the plume and hide the flash. Logs will be stacked to reinforce ceilings. Alternate telephone lines will be laid in ditches and covered with rock. The practical lesson is not that a battleship can be sunk from the shore with a single shot. The practical lesson is that a single shot can slow a bombardment for minutes and change the schedule of a day. That small change is still worth seeking. The psychological effect aboard the battleship settles like a weight that men learn to carry. The deck has a scar that every watch will pass for days. Sailors will touch the chalk ring with a knuckle as they go by, and then tuck their hands into belts. The gun crews will load in the same rhythm as before, with an extra glance at the overhead where splinters reigned. The helmsman will trace the same courses on the chart and set his jaw when the line passes the mark near the coastal road bend. Confidence does not come from believing the ship cannot be hurt. It comes from seeing that she can be hurt and still finish the plan. The logistical aftermath is tangible. Ammunition expended today must be replaced tomorrow. A replenishment oiler and an ammunition ship will meet the formation at a marked point east of the coast. Crewmen will rig highlines and pass pallet after pallet of powder and shells in a long, careful ballet. The bosuns will watch knots and clamps with a hard eye. If the sea stays reasonable, the transfer will complete in hours. If the wind rises, the transfer will stretch and the schedule will bend. Every ton loaded is another day of rails cut and portals collapsed. The arithmetic is simple and the effort is never small. The technical record grows with each action. Plotting rooms add cards that show charge temperature against dispersion for morning air. Range tables acquire pencil notes about wind shear over specific valleys. Spotter reports stack in folders that describe where ground haze hides tunnel mouths at first light. Damage control logs preserve the sequence from hit to fire, out to space clear. Over time, the collection becomes doctrine. A petty officer reads the folder during a midwatch in a dim room and learns why a delayed action fuse at a certain setting shears a berm lip better than an instantaneous setting at the same range. He will not meet the men who cut those cards. He will use their data tomorrow. Casualty reporting moves through channels with deliberate speed. A signal goes ashore. It includes names and rates and the line that all families learn to fear. The Navy uses old words for new wounds. The letters that follow will be formal and spare. A chaplain will stand at a pier a month from now and say the right words to a woman who stares at the envelope in her hand. On the ship, a medic folds a used bandage and drops it into a bin and looks at his hands. He washes them again. He returns to his log and writes a final entry for the day with a fine nib that keeps the ink from blotting on the thin paper. The broader theatre feels the echo. Carriers plan strikes to align with surface fire so that rails cut by shells remain cut under bombs. Patrol aircraft adjust orbits to watch for new barge traffic along the creeks that feed the harbour. Allied navies note that the East Coast can be kept under pressure without heavy losses if discipline holds and spotting is accurate. Enemy units redeploy a few guns away from beaches to cover inland routes that have become more vital because the port cannot absorb large cargoes. Each small move shifts the balance a little. The final consequence is the lesson that a modern capital ship still delivers in a limited war. The hull is an inheritance from an earlier conflict designed for fleet action against peer opponents. In this war, it becomes an instrument that shapes a stalemated front through pressure on infrastructure. The ship's armor turns medium-caliber hits into repairable scars. The ship's speed keeps her inside the envelope only as long as she chooses. The ship's guns remove the need to risk aircraft when weather turns marginal and targets lie within coastal valleys. None of these points ends a war. All of them change the daily math that sustains one. By the time evening fog rises in the gullies above Wonsan, the routine has settled back into place. The minesweepers edge toward their night anchorages inside the screen. The cruiser plots a midnight counter-mobility shoot on the harbour road. The destroyers trade sectors and check bearings to likely flashes. The battleship turns gently onto a course that keeps her room to swing and space to run if needed. The captain makes a single note on the bridgeboard. It reads, "Return to Songjin at first light if weather holds." He sets the chalk down. He walks to the wing and looks at the coastline where the day's dust still hangs in threads above a broken terrace. The siege continues. The consequences accumulate. The rails will be cut again in the morning unless the defenders clear the portal in the dark. That is the narrow truth that links one day to the next along this coast. History's long view reduces the duel of Wonsan and Songjin to a handful of sentences about endurance, adaptation, and limits. The first conclusion is technical and hard to dispute. A fast armored battleship with reliable spotting can enter the engagement envelope of medium-caliber coastal guns, accept limited risk, and deliver repeatable interdiction against rail tunnels, bridges, and waterfront depots. The Iowa-class combination of speed armor and heavy ordnance let the fleet hold a blockade for hundreds of days without seizing the port. That outcome shaped staff thinking about sea power's role in a positional land war. The second conclusion is operational. Shore batteries that rely on concealment, pre-measured ranges, and mines can impose friction and occasionally score damaging hits. They rarely reverse the campaign when the attacker maintains discipline, counterbattery doctrine, and air-surface integration. In practice, the shore's comparative advantage was surprise, while the fleet's was weight, precision, and persistence. The day Songjin's battery landed around showed both truths at once. The hit proved vulnerability. The measured reply proved supremacy. A third conclusion concerns logistics and tempo. Interdiction that collapses portals and cuts rails by day, forces night labor, reduces throughput, and erodes the defender's planning margin. The effect is cumulative rather than spectacular. The siege worked not because one salvo broke the system, but because hundreds of scheduled fires made repair crews chase a moving target. Debate remains on several points. Analysts disagree on cost effectiveness. Some argue that cruisers and destroyers, paired with carrier air, could have produced similar interdiction at lower operating cost than a battleship. Others note that armor magazine depth and sustained accuracy in poor weather made the capital ship uniquely efficient per mission day. A second dispute concerns battle damage assessment. Aerial photos and observer notes sometimes overstated permanence of cuts, and the defenders' rapid repair practices make exact throughput losses difficult to reconstruct. A third debate weighs psychological and propaganda effects. The shore celebrated a rare hit on a symbol of sea power. The fleet internalized a quiet confidence that a heavy ship could be struck, remain on station, and finish the plan. The legacy extends beyond the armistice. Gunnery data spotting procedures, fuse settings, and minesweeping lessons migrated into manuals and influenced later coastal operations. The East Coast siege sharpened counterbattery tactics, refined proximity fuse employment over revetments, and encouraged more deliberate air-surface timing for interdiction. It also framed the last mature use of very heavy naval guns before the missile age became dominant. In later conflicts, missiles-guided bombs and helicopters would take over much of the counter-infrastructure mission, yet the intangible lessons discipline under fire, map-first planning, and the marriage of routine with precision remained. There is also a caution. Armor and big guns solved one problem: set weatherproof, repeatable fire on fixed targets within coastal valleys, but they could not by themselves alter the political tempo of a limited war. Sea power held Wonsan shut, reduced lines feeding the front, and bought time and leverage. It did not decide the armistice. That limit is part of the record and part of the doctrine. In one line, the decision to fire on an Iowa-class battleship revealed both the vulnerability and the endurance of armored sea power, and showed how patient scheduled violence at sea can bend a stalemated war ashore without breaking it.